Gaudite, Christus is natum, ex Maria virgin gaudete. There you go. That's very seasonal, isn't it? But also Latin. So why? Well, at the risk of channeling Dan, I'm going to go grrr, Keir Starmer, abolishing Latin in state schools. Now, why is this an issue? Well, as you know, your proverbial working class boy made good, I actually did Latin at school. I have a Latin O-level and a Latin CSE. It was the same exam, but at the time they were experimenting with something called a 16 plus that later evolved into GCSE. So I actually got two certificates. And I actually really enjoyed learning Latin because I've always been quite interested in like Roman history, and I Claudius is, as far as I'm concerned, the best ever bit of British television. There are some that say you are not fit to be emperor. I agree, but then again, neither was my nephew. So what's the difference between you? He would not have agreed. Which I thought, yeah, Derek Jacobi. But anyway, to stop rambling, you obviously use a lot of Latin in the law. Now, interestingly, there have been practice directions saying, oi, cut it out. Because, you know, this whole idea that the law should be accessible and we shouldn't use shamanistic language to exclude other people. So why do we do it? Well, to be honest, it's just convenience. Because the Latin phrases we use, I suspect a lot of people don't know what they actually mean in English, but we know what they mean in law. And they're very, very useful. So to give an example, in a negligence claim, you have to set out particulars of negligence. So if, you know, for instance, you slip in the supermarket, you would have to say, the supermarket was negligent by not having a system that didn't spill things on the floor, not having a system in place that checked that the aisles were safe, not having a system in place to immediately clean up things, not placing cones or barriers around so I didn't trip up. But let's say it's something really obvious, like you're walking past, you know, you're walking out one day and a grand piano falls on your head and you think it's that pesky coyote. How do you plead that? What do you say is the negligence? Well, if a piano falls on your head, you know, there's clearly somebody has been negligent because that sort of thing shouldn't happen. So you can just, instead of doing the particulars of negligence, you can just say res ipsa. We plead res ipsa. And that's res ipsa loquitur, the thing that speaks for itself. In other words, you know, we don't have to say how they were negligent. Clearly, the thing speaks for itself. They must have been negligent, otherwise this piano wouldn't have fallen on my head. Similarly, rather than saying, oi, if you're daft enough to get in an aeroplane with your drunk mate and then it crashes, well, that's on you. But instead, you can just say, when you're defending that claim, say you're an insurer, you can just say, we raise the defence of valenti. That's valenti non fit injuria. No injury arises from a voluntary act. In other words, if you did that yourself, it's all down to you. Similarly, we have ex turpi causa, out of your wrongdoing. That's saying you cannot profit on the back of your wrongdoing. So, you know, you sort of break into my house and, well, you try to blow the safe. Not that I've got a safe, but will you try to blow the safe, you injure yourself. It's tough, you know, and you just... So we use these phrases, you know, it's like mens rea, you know, and actus reus. What do they actually mean? Well, the mens rea is the mental state that you need as part of proving a criminal offence, you know, whether that's recklessness, intention, negligence, carelessness, whatever. And the actus reus is just the act itself. I mean, you sometimes see it translated as guilty mind, but it technically doesn't mean that. So how did we end up using all this Latin? Some people say, well, you know, we were occupied by the Romans. But interestingly, there's very little, if any, actual Roman law found its way into English law. Roman law is a civil law system like they have on the continent and indeed to an extent in Scotland. Sometimes it used to be called Roman law. Sometimes it's called the Code Napoleonique because, you know, Napoleon revised the legal system, but it was all very much based on Roman law because, you know, Rome pretty much ran the continent. I mean, somebody once said that the Middle Ages ran from the fall of the Roman Empire until the fall of the Roman Empire, which is technically accurate because you had the Roman Empire in the west and then the Roman Empire in the east. But obviously it had a big sort of, influence on European law. They had very little influence on English law, and I do say English there. English law is very much based on Anglo-Saxon law and to an extent Norse law, Scandinavian law. And for a very long time, all legal documents were written in, originally Old English and then Middle English and then early modern English and now in English. But where did the Latin arise? Well, actually, that mainly came in, in the Middle Ages, because Latin was considered to be the language of scholars, which interestingly, in ancient Rome, it wasn't. Latin was what your sort of common folk spoke, and all your posh people, they actually spoke Greek. I mean, Roman law is itself very interesting, and maybe I'll do a video someday on that. I mean, one of my favourite Roman laws is, if your missus was having an affair and within one calendar month you didn't go around and bump off her toy boy, you were deemed to be cool with that. And it meant socially that, all your friends and family could invite the missus round with the boyfriend, and it was all socially acceptable. Because a lot of people were genuinely cool with it, because Roman marriage law is very, very interesting in itself, but a lot of those marriages were marriages of convenience. They were for family reasons and financial reasons and property and status. So it was like, yeah, congratulations, you two are married. Now you can both get back to with the people you like. They had a very sort of, pragmatic arrangement there. So I do quite like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it is, I don't, because people say, oh, Latin's very posh, but like I say, it never used to be. And it's a shame. I think, again, to sound, sound like Dan, but I think, this is a really good point, that apart from anything else, they've given nobody any notice of this. If they were to say, well, we're going to phase out in 3 years' time or whatever, that's fine. But they've just stopped now. So what about people who are going, well, I wanted to do Latin and have already started learning about it, hic, haec, hoc, amor, mass, amat, amatus, amatis, amant, and all that sort of thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wasn't particularly good at Latin. And we once got caught out that we were clearly cheating on homework because we had to translate a story called Pyramus and Thisbe, which all the classicists will probably be very familiar with. But that's the basis for the sort of Romeo and Juliet. It's about a boy and a girl from rival families. And they would communicate by slipping notes through a wall, a gap in a wall between their estates. The trouble is the word for wall is like mur and mus. Like where we get mural from. But it's also very similar to the word for mouse. and we basically were all sat there, sort of going like, what's this about? Well, it's a mouse, so they're passing messages with a mouse. And in the end, we basically translated as the teacher was going, so basically you think that they were just getting a mouse to run backwards and forwards carrying love notes. And it's like, yeah. And coincidentally, we all thought that. So yeah, we were rumbled. But there you go, gero rem, recordite plebes, gero rem imperialem. I used to sort of use that a lot in London when I was on the tube. Recordite plebes, gero rem imperialem. That means stand aside, plebs. I am on imperial business. Interestingly, that's the whole, plebs and plebeians. That was the two, the sort of posh people and the poor people. You had the senatorial class, the equestrian class, they were the knights. And then you had the plebs. But actually, the plebs actually technically had the most power. Although, as one Roman writer at the time said, he said they wanted the acknowledgement that they had the power, but not to actually do any of the work. But technically speaking, everything in Rome had to be approved by the tribunes of the plebs. There were 12 tribes in Rome, and each one had a tribune. And they would have sort of mass assemblies, and they'd vote on things. And anything that went through the Senate was supposed to get tribunal ratification. And interestingly, that role was considered to be so powerful. There was a bit of a scandal where somebody who was in the senatorial class arranged to be adopted by a plebeian family just so he could stand for the role of tribune, because it was so powerful. And even in imperial times, when obviously it became more of a dictatorship, the tribunes still existed. And one thing if you're a tribune is you had absolute immunity, and it was a capital offence to violate a tribune. You couldn't even touch them or accost them in the street, and they would walk around carrying sort of their rods of office. And because of that, when, for instance, any of the posh people like the senators had to sort of give the emperor bad news and turn up, they would actually collar one of the tribunes of the plebs to come with them and say, "You stand in front of us," because even the emperor could not accost a tribune of the plebs. So yeah, so like I say, it's all quite interesting and fascinating, and I just think it is a bit of a shame that kids aren't going to have an opportunity to learn this. I mean, there's also all the other stuff that studying Latin helps your English. I'm not sure if it does. I've got no idea what a declension is or what tenses are. Somebody freaked me out the other day by pointing out that English doesn't have a future tense, and which is correct. We just ask somebody, say, "What are you doing?" "I am going to St Ives." Well, does that mean you are physically walking there now, or does it mean you're planning to do that in the future? But I do find language fascinating. I mean, lawyers are manipulators of language. That is part of our job. Interpreting legal documents, drafting legal documents, but also when it comes to the practicalities, like crafting a submission or crafting an argument. I mean, I do spend quite a bit of time, and even though I tend to wing most things, I will sort of spend a bit of time plotting my one killer cross-examination question. I remember Ken Dodd saying how long he would work on a punchline to a joke, where he would look at all the different words he could use and, try and use a K word. K words are funnier, supposedly because to pronounce K you have to smile. K. But he would spend ages crafting his punchlines. And I always say the same thing to, the young barristers, spend ages, 10% writing, 90% editing, tweak things, get the perfect words, get the perfect word order, get the perfect cadence and modulation of your voice, for your either killer question or killer point. So, it's very interesting. And of course, a law, like I say, we don't have Roman law, people like Cicero are still regarded as sort of the, epitome. Is it epitome or epitome? Anyway, whatever. It's like, I don't know whether it's guacamole or guacamole. But he is considered to be one of the exemplar sort of people in rhetoric. And we actually do, we do spend a lot of time looking at rhetoric. I mean, the rhetorical flourishes and devices, we use all that rule of three. And actually, at Middle Temple, there is a guy who actually, he's a classics scholar, and he actually teaches, like proper rhetoric, old style rhetoric. I mean, some people call it showboating, but let's face it, as people have said, the bar is show business for ugly people. I'm not sure about that, but I think secretly we are all performers. I mean, fundamentally, we are storytellers, aren't we? So I think there is a lot of truth in that. But anyway, as always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely informative, vaguely accurate. Like I said, this is my seasonal one for Christmas. If I don't see you over Christmas, I hope you all have brilliant, wonderful holidays. Like I say, whether it's Christmas, Hanukkah, Yule, Kwanzaa, however you celebrate, or even if you don't celebrate, I hope you all have wonderful times. From me and the boys, say hello and say Happy Christmas. You can do it in Latin if you want. Actually, you're from Argentina, which of course is Latin America, isn't it? So you should be really good at this. And you're a duck. Oh, used to squeak. There we go.